Greetings and welcome to the I.O. Tower, a podcast for all things TRON. I'm your host, David Fleming. In this episode, I talk with TRON storyboard artist and computer image choreographer Bill Kroyer. Bill was working at Disney when Steven Lisberger lured him away to work as animator on Animalympics, and from there was among the first to begin working with Steven on TRON. Bill describes how TRON was originally conceived of as a hand-animated feature, but once Disney signed on with a bigger budget, computer animation techniques quickly expanded the possibilities. Along with storyboard artists Jerry Rees and the legendary Moebius Giraud, Bill had a blast storyboarding TRON. But the inclusion of computer-generated imagery presented the first ever challenge of moving a story through both hand-drawn and computer-animated scenes seamlessly. To meet this challenge, Bill and Jerry developed a method of conveying three space movements of digital objects, writing thousands of numbers on a first ever form of animation sheet for computer animators. After TRON, Bill worked on the similarly inspired Automan TV series, developing Automan's sidekick, Cursor, a character much like Bit from TRON. Bill shares many stories with us from his 40-plus years in Hollywood, including his time at Magi Synthavision, Digital Productions, Kroyer Films, Rhythm and Hues, and Chapman University as head of their digital arts department. Welcome to the I.O. Tower. Greetings, Bill, and thank you for talking with me on the I.O. Tower. I believe you were one of the first people to begin working with Steven Lisberger on TRON. So, how did that happen?
Well, I'm just about as early a participant as you can find because, as you know, I was Steve Lisberger's animation director at Animalympics. And when he came up with the idea to do TRON, I was one of the guys he turned to right away and said, can you start drawing storyboards and ideas for this thing?
Yeah.
And so I think that I was doing that right about the time the other person came aboard, which is Bonnie McBird, who, of course, co-wrote the project with him. So as far as longevity and early, I think I'm probably one of the earliest people to touch the project.
Wow, that's amazing.
When we started it, it was like, you have to realize that video games in those days, it was the arcade days,
Yeah.
It's a totally different world. They were still a novelty. And very few people the general public didn't really have much involvement with them. It was definitely a click. And Steve had this idea, which was a very clever idea, to have a human being gets sucked into a video game. It was just a very simple concept. And forming that idea and developing it into a story was what we did at Lisberger Studios. And Steve went out and hired a couple of pretty cool visual development artists like Peter Lloyd,
Yes.
to do development art, to give the idea of a glowing, internal world. And we started drawing little animation tests and boarding little sequences. And then Steve actually shot a little test. I don't know if you've ever seen that with Larry Anderson. But the most interesting part of that was the fact that a guy named Alan Kay, who was one of the 5 Apple Fellows, heard about the project and started flying down from San Francisco every Friday night on his own dime just to meet with us and talk about the future of computer games. And that was really fun. Alan was a brilliant guy. And of course, as you may know, that led to a budding romance between Alan Kay and the writer, Bonnie McBird, and they started dating and had been married for the past 30 years.
Yes.
How about that?
Yeah.
One thing that was kind of funny about it was they basically kind of eventually sided against Steven. They ended up having creative differences. And of course, Alan, he bonded with Bonnie. And so it turned out that the expert that Steve hired ended up kind of sort of turning against him, which was kind of
That's funny.
I don't know, I don't think Steve ever looked at it as really like quote turning against him. But I remember having very, very spirited arguments in that conference room about some of the ideas on the picture.
Yes. I guess you started working with Steve Lisberger on his 1980 film Animalympics, which just predated TRON. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I was at Walt Disney in the animation department. I believe I was working on Fox and Hound. I've been on Fox and Hound for about a year. And Steve Lisberger, and we were finishing that picture, and the next picture on the slate was going to be Black Cauldron, which did not look great.
Okay.
And Steve Lisberger rolls into town, and somehow, and this would never happen now, he got himself literally invited into the building and came into our room and basically and asked, hey, he said, can you get some of the other animators together? And we had the biggest room. I was in Frank and Ollie's old room. It was like a suite.
Wow.
And I shared that room with Brad Bird and John Musker and Henry Selick. And everybody used to hang out in our room because they called us the Rat's Nest, as you probably heard the story. But anyway, I can't believe it. Lisberger actually came in there and pitched us about leaving Disney to work for him.
You can't even travel around your own microcircuits without permission from Master Control Program. Who does he calculate he is?
I was couldn't believe that. And I'm the only one that was a sucker enough to do it. I mean, because I just thought, well, this sounds like a fun picture, and Steve sounds like a fun guy. I just don't want to work on Black Cauldron. Maybe I can come back to Disney after this. So I'm the only one that deserted, and I went to work for Steve and really enjoyed it. We had this little warehouse down in Venice, California on Andalusia Avenue, which is now Abbot Kinney Boulevard, and made the entire movie in that one building, which I'm not sure that's ever been done before or since, to make an entire animated feature film. Everything, camera, ink and paint, everything in one building.
Wow.
And that crew started to grow and became kind of legendary. We had Roger Allers, who went on to direct The Lion King. And Brad Bird, of course, when he was fired from Disney, since he was my good friend, I immediately snatched him up and said, hey, you want to work for us? And he came over and did Animalympics. And we had Daryl Rooney, who's gone on to direct like a half dozen TV movies at Sony, and Dave Steffen, one of the great board artists in town. I mean, so we ended up having like a all-star crew on that little movie.
Wow.
And a blast. We just had a blast because it was, the budget was so low and the time was so short, there was no time to overthink anything. So Steve would just come up with an idea for a hockey sequence or a swimming sequence, and he'd say, here, do something like this. And we would sit and we'd storyboard our own sequences and run them by Steve, and he'd say, do this and this and this. And then we'd often do our own layouts and animate the whole thing and hand it to one assistant. The assistant would clean it up. It would go to ink and paint. And that's how that movie was made. It was made really fast. And it has a look of a short film, almost like a Warner Brothers short.
Yeah.
But, it's a lot of fun. And then, of course, the thing happened with the boycott of the Olympics, and it was never screened in America, which was a sad thing. But anyway, it was a lot of fun to make. And that was the happy environment in which TRON was spawned.
Wow. So if I understand correctly, Bill, Steve Lisberger was already working on TRON as Animalympics was under production, and about the time that when the Olympics got canceled and Animalympics wasn't going to show, that he was pretty much ready to roll with the concept of TRON. So that's about the time he pitched to you, and you came on board for production storyboards, computer image choreography?
Well, the computer image choreography had not yet been even conceived as possible yet. Remember, that was not nobody. We thought we were going to do TRON as a hand animated film.
Wow.
And the early tests were done with hand animation on paper. And then the difference being that instead of inking and painting the paper line, the drawings, those were turned into codoliths and they were shot backlit to make them look like they were, glowing lines. That was the original idea for TRON. It was only after the project was picked up by Disney that Steve knew he was going to have a big budget, that he actually put out the feelers to the computer graphics companies in America, and they started sending in tests. The first ones I think we saw were when we'd already moved to Burbank to the Disney lot. I could be wrong about that, but I don't remember seeing any, because originally, as I said, it was going to be done as a 2D animated film with backlit effects. And as far as me coming on board, like I said, I was the animation director of Animalympics, so I just started doing assignments for TRON as I could, And then after Animalympics was done, you're right, he kept me on, and I went full bore into TRON storyboarding and everything. And the other thing about that was interesting was, at Disney in those days, it was like minimum 7 or 8 years for a beginning animator to be named a full animator. And it could take you a decade to become a director. And I left Disney, and then, about a year and a half later, I come waltzing back in, and Steve Lisberger says, "This is my animation director." And they go, "He can't be your animation director. He He just left here a year and a half ago, and Steve just said, that's too bad. He's my animation director. And so I kind of vaulted my status at Disney. I basically skipped about 8 years of work becoming an animation director at Disney on TRON.
Wow. So tell me a little bit about the storyboards that you started with for TRON.
Originally, we were boarding little bits of the script that Steve and Bonnie wrote. And those we did just enough to do things like the test you saw with Larry Anderson. But as soon as Disney picked up the project and we went into Disney, then we clicked into regular full storyboard mode. And, when we went back to Disney, again, I put the feelers out, who would like to work on this project? And the one guy who jumped at it was Jerry Rees. Jerry Rees really wanted to, he was in the animation department, but he wanted to do something innovative. By the way, Jerry has remained true to that spirit ever since. As you may know, he's become like one of the top innovative technologists of Disney feature parks, of the parks and the cruises. He does all these really new feature attractions with new technology. So Jerry has kind of retained that kind of like passion for innovative projects. But he was the one guy that came over, and then they set him and me up in a room on the second floor, a storyboard room. And then the third guy that came into that room to work with us was none other than Jean Giraud, also known as Moebius. And he came in, and the three of us just took the script and just started boarding. Wow. And I don't know if you've ever seen Moebius's work, but he was one of the greatest geniuses I've ever seen or heard of. And he immediately adopted a very simple style for boarding TRON, with markers and these cool and warm gray markers for shading. And Jerry and I just immediately adopted Moebius's technique. And that's how we boarded the whole movie. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, and every day we just go through, we just board. The three of us boarded the entire feature film in, God, I don't know, maybe 4 months, really fast. And so then we did revisions and stuff. And when that was over, Donald Kushner said, well, would you guys stay on and direct the animation? And we said, yeah.
Oh, very nice. So in all the storyboards, I have seen a good bit of Moebius's work, and particularly with respect to his work with you, I now know, on TRON. And it's just absolutely beautiful and just mesmerizing work. What would you say were some of your favorite storyboards from TRON?
Well, without a doubt, the landmark sequence that I was responsible for was the light cycle chase. It's kind of become the symbol of the entire movie,
Yes.
And Steve just handed me that idea, like all the ideas, just from the script. There was a basic idea of how it was going to work, and it's been some basic drawings about how those, Moebius. Sid Mead had already done the designs of the bikes, and and they told us it was on a grid, and Moebius had done some basic ideas, visualizations of it. But as far as breaking it down into an actual competition with shot by shot boarding, that's something that I pretty much did myself. In those days, we've said this many times, there was no computer animation. There was no software to animate things on the computer. You just basically rendered things 24 times to make a second. And so what we had to do for all the whole film, wherever there was computer graphics, is we had to storyboard pretty much precisely what we were going to see. Like what was the camera, where was the angle, what was the progression of movement throughout the frame, because you were going to then have to take that information and translate it into numbers. How far away? How fast is it moving? What's the angle? And so our storyboards had to be really almost precisely a division of what the final movie would be.
On the other side of the screen, it all looks so easy.
And because we were animators, we were used to doing that, because people who draw, you really have to imagine what you're going to have. There's no other tool. It goes from your brain onto the paper, and that's it.
Yeah.
And so the fact that Jerry and I were 2D animators made that possible, because in our heads we could see the scene. Yeah. We sat down and drew it exactly as we wanted to see it. And then that would be approved by Steve. And when that was approved, the second thing we had to do was talk to the computer company and say to them, okay, you have a unique language for your computer. How do we now describe what we see here into your language?
Right.
And they would give us, we would discuss how to describe models and describe the manipulation and describe everything else. And then we would create these series of graphs on graph paper and charts and exposure sheets, literally with XYZ yaw, pitch, roll coordinates written frame by frame.
Yes.
And one of the first things that we did was the life cycle chase. And since you couldn't see motion on a computer, you would do the storyboards, and then you do the graphs and diagrams to describe it. And then those would be broken down into numbers that a computer could absorb. And then those would be entered into the computer. And then after all that, you would generate some imagery. And the very first time that I would see my animation moving was in 70 millimeter.
Wow.
Because they would film it out on a film recorder. And the first pass, they would literally just do like what you would call like a vector test. It would just be lines, the outlines of the objects. But then we'd go into the stage at Disney, and they would project that on a 70 millimeter screen. So we're standing there, and the very first time we see our work is 70 millimeters.
That's amazing.
And I got to tell you, the first time we saw those light cycles whipping through those canyons, everybody was just blown away. No one had seen anything like that ever. Never seen that kind of motion, like in dimension. And it blew everyone's socks off, and I'll never forget that. And then and one thing about that sequence, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but all the good guys' bikes are blue. I'm sorry, I take it back. All the good guys' bikes are orange. They're like, warm colors like orange and red. But TRON and the good guys are actually wearing blue suits. And the reverse is all the bad guys are wearing orange vector lines, and they're all riding blue bikes.
This is Blue Leader to Blue Bikes. Run these guys into your jet walls. Copy, Blue Leader. Copy, Blue Leader.
It's opposite. Because when we started the movie, everybody thought that the good guys should be warm and orange and the bad guys should be cool. But then it turned out it was the opposite. The blue looked much cooler. So that's why in the TRON and his guys are riding the orange bikes and the blue bikes are getting killed. Because it's a reverse thing. I don't know if you ever noticed that. But anyway, the light sequence to me and if you ever look, you can go online and see the side-by-side comparison of my storyboards timed to the final movie, and they're just exact.
Yeah, I've actually seen on YouTube. I saw the video about the storyboarding process with you talking about the storyboards and showing us how you drew each part of the scene for the light cycles, and when TRON and RAM form a wall to block off one of the bad guy programs, and his light cycle crashes into their walls. That whole process, I think you had, I'm just guessing here, I think you had about 7 or 8 different storyboards for that one little short part of the scene. And I was wondering how you would communicate that two-dimensional drawing and the idea of the coordinates of those vehicles, the light cycles, and the parts that would fly off the debris from the collision. How would you communicate that to computer animators? And the only thing I could think of is that you must have come up with basically perhaps the first of its kind, but a 3-dimensional coordinate system, frame for frame, perhaps. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's Cartesian coordinates, right? X, Y, Z. That's how you center a location. And then, so a bike would have a center point, right? And you'd have to locate that center point every frame. And then the bike could turn it could either lean left and right, tip forward and back, or turn left and right, right? So that's yaw, pitch, roll.
Yeah.
So every bike would have six numbers for every frame.
Oh my goodness.
X, Y, Z where it is, and yaw, pitch, roll how it's aiming. And that was what you'd have to write for 24 times for 1 second of movement.
For each light cycle, for each object.
For each light cycle and the camera.
Yes, that's right, because the camera has to follow all that as the path you want the camera to go on.
The camera's moving, you got to write the camera every frame too.
Right.
The other storyboard sequence that I really enjoyed doing was the ring game. Because in the script that has sort of a basic description of it, it was really, really like one line. And I came up with that whole design of having the 2 sets of concentric rings that the guys stood on, then they would bounce a highlight ball off the ceiling and bounce it down, and if it hit one of the rings, you missed it, and the ring would disappear. So the idea was to eliminate the other guy's rings.
Yes, that's amazing.
I just came up with that idea and storyboarded it, and that stayed completely unchanged all the way into the final movie and into the video game.
My
Friends, my fellow conscripts, we have scored. I feel so much better.
They actually made it into the console game. So I always tell my students that that's the power of the storyboard artist. You know, if you draw something in storyboards and everybody likes it, it's going all the way. You know, it's not going to change.
Yes, it's the case where the customer doesn't know what they want. They need you to tell them.
Yeah, and of course the kind of the sad secret of Hollywood is that probably most directors can't really imagine in their heads what they want. They sort of describe something verbally. So if you're a storyboard artist and you come up with and say, you mean this, and you show them a drawing, they go, yeah, that's it. A lot of times that's the movie.
Wow. I also remember looking at some storyboarding you did. This was another YouTube video I found where you talked about the storyboarding for the scene where the recognizer comes out of the trash heap, basically, after Flynn has put together the parts of a recognizer to fly away. The storyboards show, I'm not sure if storyboards I saw so much as it was maybe the graph paper you're talking about, where it described the path that the recognizer would fly out and also the path of the camera as it would follow.
Yeah, I think pretty sure I have diagrams of that still. Yeah.
And the way that mapped into the actual film, it's just a few seconds of film. And today we would take something like that for granted, I'm sure, but just the idea of having the camera track and pitch and yaw as the recognizer itself does that as well was something I don't think anybody ever seen before.
Well, did you see this thing recently where these guys redid TRON in one day?
I did. It wasn't one day.
Well, it's close, though. It's like 2 days.
Yeah. I did see that.
That's where it is now. You know, it's like all that stuff we did that took so long was like handmade is nothing now.
I saw that video a couple of weeks ago. It was very impressive. They were using a 3D development platform called
Blender?
Blender, there you go. And as I watched them recreate the life cycle scene, I have to admit I was kind of hoping it would be a little harder for him.
And they kept saying in the piece, well, you know, we're not sure how they did this. And so I actually wrote those guys and I said, hey, you know, I did it. If you want to know, get a hold of me. And they never got a hold.
Yeah.
So did that for me.
Well, they said they did it in one day, but as I watched the video, they also said they actually worked on it all through the night, all-nighter, pulled an all-nighter on it. So that's fitting because of all the all-nighters I'm sure you and Richard Taylor and others pulled making TRON happen in the first place. So I'm guessing, Bill, that as you were saying earlier, you did the storyboards, and it was sort of after some more money came along for the film that computer imagery was considered. So at the outset of doing the storyboards, does that mean that you really didn't have any anticipation of translating this into computer imagery?
No, we didn't. We were just boarding it as an animated film. You know, but I have to say, as I said, very quickly after we got to Disney, the dynamic changed completely because once Steve got the Disney deal, all of a sudden having Disney behind him and all that meant just completely opened up his brain about the possibilities of the film. And also, when you have the Disney name on something, as you know, it's different than any other studio. So as soon as the word got out, as soon as Disney announced that they had signed Steve Lisberger to do a movie about a computer thing, computer companies all over the world started calling.
Wow.
And that's how that happened, you know. Anybody who could make an image with a computer was sending a sample reel and saying, hey, how about me? How about my company? But I got to tell you, there weren't many. You know, I think there were maybe a dozen, and that just shows how the business was. Because in those days, you had to build your own computers and write your own software to do computer imagery.
Yeah.
So there weren't that many companies that were seriously doing it. But we got real small of them. And when you look at the level of sophistication when we started, it was pretty primitive. And it was literally like building an airliner in flight, you know. Steve basically just had all these companies basically say, yeah, we can develop it in the next fast enough to do what you want. And so the whole movie was based on hope and faith, you know.
Wow.
Because unlike today, where you know, and believe me, this is how it's been for the last 20 years. They make you do these tests, right? And if you can't do the test and look exactly like they want, they don't want to hire you. That was not the way TRON was done. Like when I was at Digital Productions, we were the company that did Talking Animals.
Yeah.
They won the Oscar for Babe, and then we started doing all these talking animal movies like Dr. Dolittle and Cats and Dogs and Scooby Doo and Garfield and all these movies.
Right.
And we had made like 250 different talking animals, from raccoons to dogs to monkeys to cows to sheep. And we'd still get these commercial houses saying, well, we'd like you to do a test. And we go, a test of what? And they go, well, we want a black and white bulldog. We go, we've done like 60 dogs. Don't you believe we can do this? Well, you haven't done our dog.
Yeah.
Now, and compare that to TRON, where there was no company in the world in 1980 that could have produced anything at all that looked like the light cycle or the
Right.
solar cycle.
So
no
what
one
could you even test against? What could you be asked to test against?
Yeah, so you couldn't ask for a test to prove you could do it because no one could do it. So you got to give Steve Lisberger amazing credit for talking to these people and having the guts to say, I believe that when we get there, they'll have the tools to do this. And that was how that movie was made.
It really was made just on the fly. I mean, the technology, you created it at the time, just in time technology.
We literally waited to see what would show up on Monday. We didn't even know.
Wow, that's truly amazing. So I get a sense from your portfolio that the computer-based theme as part of a storyline continued after TRON. You were the animator for Cursor from Automan, which was 83 to 84. Automan was one of my favorite series growing up as well. Did Cursor reminds me of Bit from TRON a little bit. Was Bit or the idea of the hero having a sidekick part of what resulted in Cursor?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the Bit was just one of those cases where we'd sit around with the computer companies and say, what can you guys do? Can you do this? Can you do that? Well, we can't do fabric. We can't do liquid.
Right.
We can't do this. We can't do that. What can you do? Well, we can make things interpenetrate. What does that mean? And then they'd show us, see, it passes right through each other. We go, oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And so based on that, we just invented the Bit.
Yeah.
Just to exploit something that the computer could actually do that looked different than what people had seen on the screen before. And that's how the Bit came about. And when Donald Kushner, who, of course, produced TRON, sold the idea of Automan, which is a TRON spin-off unofficially, he felt that would be a fun thing to have, would be a little Tinkerbell type of the Cursor, and that's how he came up. And of course, he went to me and said, well, you're my animator for computers. Can you do this? And I went, yeah, I'd love to do that. So we did it, and it was a lot of fun.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. So I guess when I think about Bit, all the paths and the swoops and the quick movements that Bit would make, that seems faster from frame to frame than, say, tracking a recognizer coming down the canyon, which is sort of a bigger, hulkier vehicle that moves a little more slowly, if you will. Was the movement of Bit communicated in the same coordinate manner that you use for other things, the 3-space?
Yeah, in TRON, that was the only way you could do it.
Yeah.
Still just Cartesian coordinates, but you're an animator, so animators time things and make things move according to the characters.
Right.
It's not a question of the technology, it's a question of the artistry.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the storyboarding that you and I guess Jerry Rees and Moebius, the three of you, just really hammered through all the storyboards for TRON. Am I getting that right?
Yes, you are. That's exactly it.
I can only imagine what it would be like to work with the likes of Moebius. Did you also get to work with Sid Mead and Peter Lloyd on a routine basis?
Well, Peter I worked with for years because we met him at Digital Productions, and then he worked down at the Animalympics office with us, and then he ended up coming over to Disney. So I had the pleasure of working with Peter Lloyd personally for many years. Moebius, Sid Mead very rarely came by. He just worked in his own studio.
Okay.
And he sent drawings in. So even though I met Sid, I never had a chance to sit with him and work with him.
I'd like to ask you about TRON, the story of TRON, and the world we're in today. Do you have any thoughts on the relevance of TRON, what it is to be in the computer or to have a computer run our lives as compared to today's society?
I don't know. I think that there were some things that there were general themes of TRON about, being cautious about artificial intelligence, I guess that would be the biggest and most obvious and most relevant thing, although it may not be the way that people think. I do think that the artificial intelligence that I think it can be a real threat to the way, to a lot of people, but not in the way that it was pictured with the MCP. The MCP seemed like a malicious guy who was out to gain power. But what's really going to happen is artificial intelligence, which is coming on really fast, is going to basically replace the need for human activity in many, 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 many areas, especially information and research and advice, like legal research, legal advice, medical research, medical advice, real estate. Artificial intelligence will be able to do so many of those informational jobs and advising jobs far more effectively than human beings can do.
Now, wait a minute, I wrote you.
I've gotten 2,415 times smarter since then.
And that's going to be a real issue, It's really going to be a real issue to to the whole job market. Right. So in a weird sort of way, I think that's, that's the one thing people, remember what's his name talked about singularity, we all know about, Skynet and how we're all afraid that AI is going to basically kill us that way. It's probably not going to kill us that way.
Right.
But what it is going to do is it's just going to become so much more economically, profitable for business that they're going to just start putting it in, and you're going to see a sea change in the way, human beings live their lives. And I think, ironically, that's one thing that's going to happen. The other thing I always liked, that was the whole principle of the underlying operating system being flawed, I still think that's an interesting theme that you could sort of talk a little bit about, but that's another deal. Yeah. After TRON, look, I had the hook about this computer animation thing. It was so exciting. It was so groundbreaking. It's like, how often in your life do you come up on an artistic medium that no one has ever done before?
There you go.
Where every day you can conceivably do something that no one has ever done. It was just so exciting to me. And so the very first thing I did after TRON was work for Magi Synthevision, which was one of the companies that did TRON. And Richard Taylor was over there at Magi, and I did a couple of commercials for them, like Wormwar One, where I basically animated it the way I animated TRON. And then after that, I worked for Donald Kushner and did the Cursor thing. And then right after that, the guys who founded Triple I, which was the company that did the Solar Sailor, those guys started a new company called Digital Productions. That was John Whitney and Gary Demos. And they were down in the marina in LA. And I knew them, of course, from TRON. And I went down there and said, do you guys need an animator? And they said, we're just beginning to start to do animation. We don't really have animation software still, but we know you know how to work with this stuff. So, yeah, you should come aboard. So they had just completed The Last Starfighter, which was a big step forward in computer graphics. And I went down there, and my whole job was to bring character animation to the computer. And so that was my singular kind of like assignment at Digital Productions. And so we just started doing commercials and things using, and basically slowly inventing hierarchical structures and other means to animate characters. And, we did some really interesting stuff. We did, Hard Woman for Mick Jagger. We did the Owl for Jim Henson's movie Labyrinth. So it was an interesting time, and that was Digital Productions. And I worked there for a couple of years. I think from like middle of '84 to the middle of '86, and then that was when that thing happened where this company called Omnibus bought everybody. There were three big companies in LA. There was Omnibus, Robert Abel, and Digital Productions. And Omnibus was owned by these big some investing conglomerate. And they said, well, wait a minute, we can basically completely control the computer graphics business if we buy these other two companies, Robert Able and Digital Productions.
Oh, okay.
Because neither of them was really doing that well. So they bought both companies. And since Robert Able was the best salesman and the flashiest guy, they basically dumped Digital Productions and tried to move everybody into Robert Able.
Oh, okay.
So at that point I left. So
okay.
There was a period of about 6 weeks where I was still in the Digital Productions building and still working on the Digital Productions machines, but was technically getting a Robert Able paycheck.
Oh, okay. There
is kind of a funny story that during that time I was invited to speak at a computer convention in France called Imagina in Monte Carlo. And I flew over there with Jeff Kleiser. I don't know if you know Jeff Kleiser. He's a really famous visual effects guy. And he actually did work at Robert Able. So they flew the two of us over to do a presentation in Monte Carlo, and we stayed at this very nice hotel, the Lowe's Hotel. And when I filled out my registration for the hotel and it put down company name, I put down Robert Able and Associates, because technically they had folded Digital Productions into Robert Able.
Yeah.
When I went to check out of that hotel, they slapped like $2,000 onto my bill, which at the time was a lot of money. That would be like maybe $20,000 today. I went, what is this? This is a mistake. And they go, oh no. They said Robert Able was here last year and he left without paying his bill, so we gave it to you. I said, but I don't really work for Robert Able. And they went, so I actually went to Jeff Kleiser and I said, look, Jeff, you actually work for him. You have a much better chance of getting him to pay this. And believe it or not, Jeff Kleiser, what a guy. He had them switch that money to his bill and eventually got Robert Able to pick it up. So anyway, that was my big experience with Robert Able.
So I think around that time, 1986 or so, is that when you started Kroyer Films?
It was after Digital Productions closed. Yeah, it was after that crash when everything was kind of dead. That I think that Star Chaser film happened right about then. And I was out of work, and they called me up and said, look, we're doing these computer spaceships, but they're really a mess. Can you come in and help save this? And I came in and I said, okay, I'll do that. So I went in and I animated all the computer spaceships in this movie, Star Chaser.
Nice.
And while we were doing that, they were using a very simple plotter system to do that. And I saw that idea and I thought, this is a really cool thing to do. If you could build complex computer objects, but render them as drawings, it would be really, you could get the power of computer imagery and combine it with hand-drawn organic stuff, and you could do everything.
Yeah.
You know, there's many things computers couldn't do, but there's many things hand-drawn artists couldn't do. So I thought this is a way where you could do everything, and that was my idea for Kroyer Films. And so I approached my friend Tim Heidman, who was a software engineer, and I said, could you write this program? And he went, yeah, I can write it. And so I took out I can't remember how I got that money. I got a loan, and then I funded Tim to do that, and he created that software.
Nice.
And then we said, well, we got to do something with it. So then we, I forget how I met Michael Bryant, but I met a guy named Michael Bryant who was a motocross racer, and he had an idea for a kids show about motocross racing called Ultracross, but he couldn't figure out how you could animate motorcycles by hand. And I said, well, I have a system that can do exactly that. And so together we developed this idea for this TV show, and I had this test software that was just sort of not quite done, and we had this idea. We went out, we tried to, and no one would understand what we were talking about, and no one would give us a deal. And I'll never forget this night. And by the way, I just recently was on a show or an interview where somebody was saying that almost everybody who's ever sold a show has had this very same experience. I was literally broke. I couldn't figure out how I was going to make my next mortgage payment. I'd used up all my savings. I owed this loan and the software. I really was wondering, how am I going to make it through the next couple of weeks? And literally the phone rang, and it was Michael Bryant. And he was literally at a party, and he had met a guy at the party who was this new development executive for Steven Cannell. And the guy's job was to find interesting new animated kid shows. And he heard about our Ultracross show, and Michael said, he wants to meet with us tomorrow morning.
Oh, boy.
And we went in and we met with that executive, Jeffrey Scott, and he bought our show on the spot.
I knew you'd escape. They haven't built a circuit that could hold you.
Ultracross. And it was never finished because here's what happened. In those days, all children's television was based on toys. Literally every show was really existed pretty much just to sell a toy. And so when we came up with this cool idea for Ultracross, everybody loved the idea, but the main value of it would be to sell these motorcycle toys.
Right.
So we went around and we met with all the big toy companies. There was a company that they liked. I can't remember the name of this company, but it wasn't one of the really big ones, but they made a deal with this company to do the Ultracross toys. And so we started production on the show, Ultracross. We were going to use Nelvana in Toronto for the animation. And then we would do all the computer animation here in Hollywood in our studio. And we started making that series, and we got about 6 episodes in when the toy company went bankrupt.
Oh.
And Steven Cannell said, well, the contracts are all wrapped up in the bankruptcy, and so it's a mess, so we're canceling it. So he canceled the show.
You got about 6 episodes of the show done?
We did 6 episodes of the computer animation. We had done the storyboards. Nelvana had just started doing a little bit of the production of the characters, but nothing was ever finished in color,
Okay.
We never even got 1 episode finished in color.
Wow.
But so what I ended up with was by that time, I had finished the software, right, to do this hidden line stuff. And I had the computer and I had the plotter, so I could do the exact process that I had envisioned, but I had no show. So Stephen J. Cannell, who had canceled the show, was such a nice guy. He said, look, you don't have to get out of your office. You can use that office for like the next 4 months if you want. Nice. He was really nice about it. And so I said, we got to do a demo here, like right away, to show people what we can do, because nobody has ever seen this before. We need to do something to show we can do. And that was the idea of technological threat.
Yes. I love that. I found that and watched that and just loved it.
Yeah, we said, let's do something where half the characters are done by computer and half are done by hand. And I just had that idea, that computers replacing hand-drawn animation.
Yeah, yeah.
A metaphor we thought would happen. And so we just knocked out technological threat in just a few months. And I had some money saved over from the Ultracross job. They paid me some money, and I basically, once again, I spent all the money on technological threat. And we got that movie made, and it just went crazy. It started winning film festivals, and it got an Academy Award nomination.
I saw that. That's great.
That was not even in my realm of imagination at the time that I could ever get an Academy Award nomination. But as soon as that happened, amazing. The work just started flowing in, and all of a sudden, our little company was going. And one of the things we did was Computer Warriors. Mattel came to us and said, so that one, instead of creating a show and then making a toy line, they already had a toy line. So they wanted to do the show. So that's what we did. A very low budget too. It was really, really not the greatest quality thing. It was super low budget. But we were, kind of looking for different kinds of jobs and thought it would be fun to do. So we did it.
Yeah. I thought Computer Warriors was really interesting because it's kind of a slice from my childhood, having grown up with Commodore 64s and Apple IIs and working with diskettes and things like that. It was kind of like, it sort of represented when the kid in Computer Warriors takes his handful of disks to go over to his friend's house to use his computer. That was basically me at that age. So.
Well, that's the thing, once again, it was pretty innovative, and that's why it was fun to do,
I know you have so many other films you worked on. I'm just going to read them off here. Jetsons, Ferngully, Green Mile, Flintstones, Rugrats in Paris. What about, I see a company here, Rhythm and Hues. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, that was basically a third of my professional career, basically, was spent at Rhythm and Hues, because we had Kroyer Films, and we did Ferngully, and then we did some other projects. But after Ferngully, we were trying to develop our own feature, and it was impossible to get finance because all the studios had decided they didn't want to fund independent studios doing animation. They wanted their own in-house animation department. So Sue and I ended up signing a deal with Warner Brothers to go in and help develop movies. We went to Warner Brothers for a couple of years, but that didn't work out. We just didn't like the direction they were going at all. We just didn't fit there.
When you've been in the system as long as I have, you hear many promises, many reassurances, many brave plans.
And so we left there, and literally right after I left there, I got a call from my agent saying, hey, they got some computer animated commercials down at Rhythm and Hughes. They're looking for a director. Would you like to go down there? And I had known the Rhythm and Hughes founders since they founded the company. John Hughes, Pauline Cho, Keith Golver. I'd known them. I'd been to the Rhythm and Hughes and visited them because it was a small industry at the time. Yeah. So I was kind of like, yeah, I'd love to work with those guys. So I went down there, and they put me at a desk in one of the rooms, and I stayed at that desk for 12 years.
Wow.
And just kept doing. It was so exciting because Rhythm and Hughes was doing. They'd just gotten the Oscar for Babe, right?
Wow.
And they were doing just the most cutting edge computer graphic stuff. And they were like one of the top studios in the world, doing all this amazing work. And I just started. I started with commercials, but then when we got our first feature deals, like I was animation director on, I think the first one I did was the Flintstones, Beaver Rock Vegas. Then we did Cats and Dogs, Scooby-Doo, Garfield, Rugrats. Started doing all these movies, and I was animation director on all those movies. And it was a blast, And then I did tons of commercials, too. I must have done 50 commercials at movies. We did Coca-Cola Polar Bears, all these really fun things. So I absolutely loved Rhythm and Hughes. It was the most wonderful place to work, the nicest bosses, the greatest people, and the most family-like atmosphere created by the owners, because it was not owned by a corporation. It was owned by the 4 artists, and they treated everyone like family. And I have to say, it was one of the greatest studios. And the reason that wonderful in the end was it was just unfair that you could not survive in the in the 90s if you didn't have a huge corporation owning you, because that was when foreign subsidies kicked in, and tax breaks and other stuff. All the visual effects in Hollywood started going everywhere else in the world but Los Angeles. Oh. Rhythm Hughes was really the last holdout, and they finally won the Academy Award for The Life of Pi, and 7 days after the Oscars declared bankruptcy.
Goodness.
It's really a sad story, But I have to say that my time there was completely wonderful. I just had a great time. And then what happened to me was, of course, by the time 2010 rolled around, I'd been there for 12 years. I was the oldest person in the building, other than John Hughes, the owner. And, the business was changing. It was, as I told you, it was getting much rougher. The hours were getting much longer. You were working 50, 60-hour weeks and everything. And I was just not really feeling like that was right for me. And that was this opportunity came to teach at Chapman. Chapman University called me up and said, you fit the profile perfectly for what we're doing, for someone to build our animation visual effects program. And I had the very same thing happen there. I went down there, and it was the most amazing place with the most amazing facility and the nicest people and the best bosses. And I said, wow, this is the right thing for the next step. And so I left Rhythm and Hughes. And then, of course, a year later, Rhythm and Hughes was bankrupt, so that would turn out to be a good move. But anyway, that was how that all worked.
That sounds amazing. And Chapman University, if I recall, in the top 10 film animation schools in the world, top 6 in the country.
Yeah, that's it. That's us.
Wow.
we're way up there. I actually think we deserve to be higher, but some places rest on their laurels.
So I also wanted to ask you, I think you've worked with your wife, Susan, on several projects. Did you and Susan start Kroyer Films together, and what projects have you done together?
Yes, we did. We started Kroyer Films together. Well, we met at Disney. We met back when I was on Fox and Hound. Sue was a key assistant animator of the Disney animation department. That was where we met, Disney in those days was like being in Iowa. It was like this family environment in the middle of Hollywood, and everybody, I still have dozens and dozens of close friends from those 40 years, still very close friends, because we just bonded so much as animators. Anyway, that's how Sue and I met. We met there. And then during the next decade, when I was doing computer stuff, she was doing 2D. She worked for Richard Williams and Ragged Ann. She worked for Eric Goldberg on Ziggy's Gift. So she was busy doing 2D animation as a freelance animator. And then when we got this idea for Kroyer Films, of course, we did that together. And then she came in and became kind of the art director, producer of our company. And she was really the casting director. She found all the talent, like Tony Facilli and Ralph Eggleston and, just superstars that she developed. Stephen Pilcher. I mean, she literally found Steve Pilcher by looking at a children's book and saw this Canadian guy up in Toronto who had just done a children's book, and that's all he had ever done. And she contacted him and said, would you like to help design an animated show? And then we actually flew to Toronto and met him and hired him to do a project for us. And then he came down here, and of course he ended up at Pixar, and he was the animation director of Brave. I mean, designed Brave, and he designed Toy Story 4. He's become one of the greatest production designers in all of animation. And that was all because of Sue. Sue basically could recognize talent. Chris Sasaki became one of Pixar's #1 character designers. She walked by the desk at Woodbury and saw his drawings on the desk and said, "Who did these?" And she instantly knew the guy was a superstar, and she nurtured him and got him into Pixar. So,
wow,
Sue was really the secret weapon behind our company, and all of the reason anything we did looked good was because she was the one who found the right people, or else guided us with the direction. So we were a pretty good team, And then anyway, so that's and then when Kroyer Films closed, she didn't want to go to Rhythm Hughes. So she ended up, she got into teaching way before I did. She was hired at CalArts to teach animation, and that's where she started. And so she taught for years before she got me into it.
Very good. I see that the two of you won the June Foray Award from the International Animation Society for contributions to the art and industry of animation, 2017, I believe.
Yep, we did. I think we were the first couple to do that.
Wow.
And that was a really nice moment to do that as a couple,
Yeah.
Because I really felt that was appropriate, because we, as a unit, individually we're okay, but as a couple, I think we're pretty good.
Nice. That award in 2017, I think, is a testament to how long you've been able to contribute to film animation.
We came out here the same month, March 1975. So 45 years ago. It was very different, believe me. Very different. I've had the most blessed career. I came out here from Chicago, knowing absolutely no one, with literally no skills, and just, I've had such great fortune, going from great job to great job with great people, and just really, really, I've had a wonderful career here in Hollywood.
Music from the TRON soundtrack. Additional music is Water by Tenger and Give Us Color by Zen. Intro music by me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support the I.O. Tower at patreon.com/ddprogram. Until next time, I'm your host, David Fleming. End of line.